The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
Tonight, a conversation with John Fery, Chairman of the Board of the Boise Cascade Corporation. Good evening. For at least the last 2 years, the timber and wood products industry, a key element in the Idaho economy, has been reeling from the effects of the deepest recession in 40 years. Now, many timber companies are reporting significant recovery from that recession. That is one thing we'll be discussing tonight with John Fery, the Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of Boise Cascade Corporation. Boise Cascade is one of the principal paper, wood products, and building materials companies in the country, and is, of course, headquartered in Boise. Welcome, Mr. Fery. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Mark.
Despite my rather optimistic beginning, let me ask you about some news on the downside just within the last few days. A March decline in housing starts, one of the biggest in 20 years, the biggest decline. What does that indicate to you? Anything?
2 points, Mark. One, that decline is coming off a very large base, so it makes the 20% a little less significant. We're still at levels in the 1,600,000 to 1,700,000 annual start range, and that's a relatively healthy market. But it may be signaling a softening of housing starts for the balance of this year, and that goes to the second point. Housing is a cyclical business, not from a demand standpoint, but from a supply standpoint. The supply is determined largely by the cost and availability of money. And as you've probably noted, it appears, interest rates are in fact beginning to go up. And if they get much higher, that's certainly going to have an adverse effect on the availability of new housing.
Do you think they will go higher?
If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be in another business. My judgment is that they will continue to increase modestly through the balance of this year. The question is, will they continue to increase into 1985? My judgment again is that that depends largely on what happens to our federal deficit. If the deficit is attacked by this Congress and this administration, then I think we have the possibility of continuing strong economy throughout this year and next at today's interest rates, if you will, or even less. But if the perception is that that the deficit will continue to grow, then I think that will force interest rates up, and that's going to have a very adverse effect on the availability of money, the cost of money. It's going to adversely affect our interest-sensitive industries like housing, autos, and that could spell the beginning of a major downturn in our economy again.
I want to come back to, I know your concerns about the deficit situation, but let me ask you about one other housing statistic recently. A number of stories about a decline nationally in home ownership, in the percentage of people who are owning homes today. What does that say about what many people still consider the American dream of owning their own home? Is that becoming less and less of the American dream?
I don't think it reflects a change in the American dream. I think it does reflect this affordability issue of high interest rates, which have prohibited a lot of people from being able to exercise that dream and buy a home. We took a survey, I say we, our industry, took a national survey here 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, by a reputable firm in the field to try to determine what was the American dream today as it related to home ownership. And it came back resoundingly that the American people want home ownership. They want their own single-family dwelling with a white picket fence. The issue is affordability. And that affordability issue obviously is impacted by materials costs, by labor costs, but the largest single cost in owning a home today and purchasing a home today are the interest costs. So if we can keep interest costs down in the 12, 13% range or lower, I think you'll see that dream being exercised, just as we began to see it being exercised last year and the very first part of this year, when housing starts got up to an annual rate of over 2 million starts. Interest rates were down. As soon as interest rates started up again, in the last couple of months, housing starts started declining. So it's a very interest-sensitive business. But the dream is still there.
Let me go back to the deficit situation. You and several dozen, I think, I didn't count them all, but several dozen corporate executives had your names on a big ad in the New York Times and probably other places a few days ago, calling for immediate action to deal with the federal deficit, including a reform of entitlements, addressing the defense budget, and tax increases. My question is, just how worried are you about this deficit situation?
Well, I think it's, in the short term, it is the most serious problem that our nation faces. I say the short term, long term as well, but we're going to see the adverse effects in the short term if, in fact, Congress and the administration don't attack it.
And the short-term manifestation most immediately is interest rates.
Exactly, and within the next few months. And part of it's a perception problem. If it's perceived that interest rate or that the deficit will continue to increase, with that perception comes the acknowledgement that there is a limit to what deficit this country can withstand. Because not only does the deficit get bigger, we owe more money, but we have to pay interest on more money. So as long as the perception is that interest or that the deficit will increase, I think that's going to put a serious hold on any economic progress in our country. People are not going to invest, they're not going to buy homes, they're not going to buy automobiles, they're not going to make the, business is not going to make the capital investment required to keep this, to keep American industry productive and to keep economic activity going, and you're going to go into a recession. So the most important issue facing this country in terms of its future standard of living, in terms of employment levels, in terms of inflation levels, all get back to that deficit and the cost of maintaining it, which affects the cost and availability of money. And the cost and availability of money reflect the progress a nation can or can't make.
Haven't we had a rather serious across-the-board failure in political leadership to deal with this issue? The Congress seems unwilling to move. The President seems unwilling to move during an election year. They can't agree on the priorities. The President says absolutely no way to a tax increase unless it's well, anyway, and the Congress wants to make significant cuts in defense. We're really in a logjam, aren't we?
We have been in a logjam. I must show my bias in saying that the President has made it very clear that he will entertain a tax increase, but it has to be accompanied by expenditure decreases. And Congress has not been able yet to agree on what those decreases will be and what form the tax increases will come in. I'm not putting all the blame on Congress. I think both can share the blame in it. But Congress today is going to have to make the next move because the President has indicated flexibility in both defense spending and increasing taxes if there are some decreases in some of our decreases in the rate of growth, not decreases or takeaways, but decreases in the rate of growth of some of our social spending. So I think Congress now has the challenge, and now to get both sides of that aisle to agree is a problem.
That advertisement I mentioned also talked about tax increases. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I agree with it as long as it's tied to expenditure decreases. No question about it.
In retrospect, did the much celebrated Reagan tax cut really go too far? Just in terms of its impact on the deficit and in terms of how that has impacted the economy or could impact the economy?
I'm not an economist, Mark. My judgment is that if you provide more money in the hands of the people and business to spend, the very spending of it will strengthen, accelerate the economy. And I think that was a part of the impetus behind the tax cut. But you can't have a tax cut without having major expenditure reductions, and we didn't get that side of the equation. Having said that, look at the economy today compared to what it was 3 years ago.
Let me just interrupt to say, though, that one of the theories, it seems to me, about the Reagan tax cut was that by cutting taxes at the rate that they were cut, that would stimulate investment, that would stimulate spending on the part of the American people, and that would increase revenues.
That's right, and I think it did. I think it stimulated spending. It stimulated business activity, and I think we're seeing the results of that. But at the same time, because we did not attack the spending side of the ledger, we had a continued increase in the budget deficit. And you can't have both very long. You can't have spending at a deficit level, at the government level, while the folks are also spending. At some point in time, they have to reconcile. So I think the tax cut did stimulate the economy. And as a result, we have the lowest unemployment we've had in some years. And by the way, we got rid of most of inflation at the same time. The economy today is in pretty good shape. But it can't be sustained unless we work on the expenditure side, one, the government expenditure side. And two, yes, I think we're going to have to go back on a selective basis and make some changes in the tax levels. And I would support that, providing we get the expenditure cuts.
Let me sketch just briefly for you a worst-case scenario where the Congress and the President remain in this political gridlock over this issue. Interest rates are going up toward the end of the year and looking like on some trend that way. Could we find ourselves a year from now in the same situation we found ourselves, say, in 1982, where the economy is just rapidly deteriorating again?
I don't think there's any question about it, and it's what I fear. And the thing that's so sad about it is that it's unnecessary. If Congress and all their wisdom can get together on expenditure decreases and a reasonable tax program, we can avoid that. But we're headed in that direction in 1985 or 1986 unless we do something about the deficit. No question.
Let me ask you about one little piece of that deficit. The Congressional Research Service recently reported that timber harvesting in national forests is contributing directly to the deficit to the tune of several $million a year in Idaho. In other words, the costs of preparing the timber sales, the costs of building roads and reforesting the land that has been cut far exceeds the revenue derived from those sales. $18 million, according to that service, in 1982 in Idaho alone. Isn't that a subsidy that maybe we should look at in terms of dealing with this entire problem of the federal deficit?
I think you're referring to what they call deficit sales of timber.
Yes, sir.
There are some sales that occur. The 18 million, frankly, sounds high from what I have heard, but in any event, there are sales in Idaho and in other parts of the country from the federal government, by the federal government, to industry, where in fact initially there's a deficit borne by the federal government. The reason for that is that in some of these sales, roads are required to get to the timber, and the government in effect pays for that roadway to be put in. And the cost of the roadway versus the amount they get off that specific sale causes a deficit. But that's almost an accounting issue because that road is there forever. It's there to provide access to other timber sales. It's there for forest management. It's there for fire management. So that's a one-time expense, which then enables the government to have access to that region permanently. But they put all of the cost of that one-time expense against that one sale, and then it's referred to as a deficit sale. Long-term, it is not a deficit sale. It's an investment in the future. So
long-term, it wouldn't impact the federal deficit?
It should not, no. If it would, the sale should never have been made in the first place. And I don't know of cases where the federal government over time will not recoup their value from that capital expenditure on the front end. So it is a short-term problem, and in the short term it is a deficit, yes. In the long term, it's like any other capital investment. They should get their return back, and I believe do. And by the way, there aren't many sales of this type. Most of the sales are being made where there are already most of the roadways in, because that deficit, if you will, was covered many years ago. Most sales today bring a positive cash flow to the federal or to the state government, whichever is involved. And in fact, the government has been losing revenue today because there haven't been the harvesting of a lot of those sales during this past few years of a very difficult economy. So that has been had a negative effect on the government. But to be fair to the issue, the sale of timber to industry is one of the few positive cash flow opportunities the federal government has.
I think some of the critics of the way the Idaho delegation has handled the wilderness issue would say that when some of those lands that are now roadless are one day logged, that would be a deficit situation, and it would be, that's one of the arguments that they use for saying, you know, the economics just aren't there to log a lot of that area. Not true?
Again, in the long term, I don't think there's a sale that the federal government makes that is going to be a deficit sale. But in the first sale in a given area, that could be while we're paying for, the government is paying for, the infrastructure. So if I understand your question correctly, I don't know where the wilderness issue enters into that. In the long run, any land that is properly designated for multiple use is so designated because it in fact can produce a revenue from timberland, from recreation, from other activities, whereas a wilderness area produces absolutely no revenue other than the few people who are physically able to hike through it. Now that isn't a speech against wilderness because I happen to support an amount of wilderness area. The problem we're getting to in this state, where we have almost 4 million acres of wilderness, second only to the state of Alaska as being the most in the United States. I think we probably have enough wilderness as long as we're sure, and I feel quite confident about this, that we have protected the pristine areas of our state, because I think those have to be protected. Beyond that, you know, if, as someone said the other day, if the preservationists had had their way in the late 1800s, we wouldn't have a Yellowstone National Park or a Glacier National Park, because those things would not be permitted under wilderness. So I think we've gone as far as we need to in the state of Idaho in locking up more wilderness land, as far as we need to once the present recommendation of some 500,000 acres is adopted.
On balance, Senator McClure, in your view, has done a good job with that bill?
I think he's done a very good job. In fact, he's performed, I think, a statesman's role in trying to get other states, other congressional leaders together on an agreement on release language, which I think he's accomplished, so that we do ensure that once the decision is made and those lands that go back into a non-wilderness classification are not subject to another review a few months later, which has tied up the use and the development of many of our lands in this country. You know, it's interesting. We have in the state of Idaho, we have wilderness and we have national forests. The national forests, like the Boise National Forest, are used for recreation, whether it's ski areas, campgrounds, campsites, in some cases second home sites. We have many lakes and many streams. People enjoy the use of the national forest. They have access, there are roads to them. There's economic value to a national forest, and it's also managed in a multiple use concept. To the extent that certain of it ought to be timber ought to be harvested, that's available. In a wilderness area, the economic value is gone once it's declared a wilderness area. So I think we have to be very, very careful how much land we take out of the reach of most of our citizens, out of the view of most of our citizens, out of the use of most of our citizens, and with little economic impact.
Is there a value to that wilderness land beyond its economic value? Just the fact that it is there?
Sure. Sure there is. And that's why we better have some. And that's why we have today, what, some 80 million acres in this country? And there'll be more after this present legislation is passed. It's a question of how much, Mark. And I think to have most of the state of Idaho in government ownership and now tying up a substantial part of it, which really assures little access, I'm not sure makes a lot of sense, because multiple use land can be managed so that you get all of these other intrinsic values from it, as well as an economic value. As you've, I'm sure, heard me say before, a tree is no different than a human being. It grows to a certain life cycle, dies, disappears. Trees can be harvested, forest lands can be managed so you get reproduction, so that all forms of life can enjoy it, enjoy the environment, if it's managed properly. And that's what we ought to be stressing in this nation, is let's manage our forests for multiple use so that everyone benefits. Protect those pristine areas where logging or mining or other acts of man would materially change the appearance or the shape of the land forever. Protect those through wilderness, but let the rest be properly managed for all uses.
What sort of reaction would you have if that McClure proposal, the Idaho delegation proposal, were rather substantially changed in the House, as there is talk that it will be, by adding significant numbers of additional acres to that bill? That'd be a bad development, I take it.
Yeah, I think that, yes, I think it would be unfortunate for the state and for the country. The long-range effect of that will have a serious long-term impact, in my judgment, on our state, and to the extent that there are minerals or timber opportunities there for the nation. Because we are a state who has the ability to supply some of these natural resources. And one of the charms of supplying a timber resource is that we are dealing with a renewable resource. That opportunity would be diminished.
Mr. Fery, your company, Boise Cascade, was in the view of many people highly visible during the last session of the legislature, with your lending the support of your personnel on the IACI higher education study. You lobbied hard on a couple of different issues, on the initiative process and on legislation that affects downtown Boise's redevelopment. Is that a new corporate idea for Boise Cascade to be more visible politically, to take more public positions on those sorts of issues?
Well, our activities of this past year, be they in Idaho or Washington, D.C., or Salem, Oregon, Olympia, Washington, are no different than they've been historically. We take the view that it is a responsibility and an opportunity to try to affect decisions of government that in turn affect our constituents. And our constituents range from our shareholders to our employees, our customers, the communities in which we operate, and the like. And any time that we see an issue that can affect those constituents, we will become involved in it if it's important enough to those constituents. We have felt that some of those issues were before us in this state. Most noteworthy, the educational issue. We supported financially and in terms of the time and energy of a lot of our people to participate in a study of the higher educational system of this state. We think it was a well-done study. The next step was to get it through the legislature, and we supported the activities, or we supported the report in trying to get adoption of that report and the elements of it in the legislature.
Disappointed that it didn't happen?
Disappointed in one sense and understanding in the other. We have a number of operations in North Carolina. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, a number of business people, opinion leaders in the state, got together and implemented a study, not unlike the IACI study of higher education in Idaho, for the state of North Carolina. Once that study was completed, and it took, like the IACI study, many, many months, it took that group about 4 years to implement that study through the legislature. So these things take time. I'm very pleased with the progress that was made. One, the completion of the study. Two, to be fair to it, there were a couple of constitutional amendments required, and we came within 1 to 4 votes of getting those approved in this legislative session of the first go-around.
One little bit of conventional wisdom about why those recommendations didn't do better was that, frankly, the business community in Idaho didn't give much of a signal to the legislature that they were willing to help pay for some of those changes.
Well, that's interesting. I sat in the governor's office about a year ago with a group of business people that the governor had invited to the meeting. We went around that room, and these were most of your large businesses represented here in the state, and almost to the company. They said to the governor, and have subsequently said, we'll pay our share to improve the education, higher education in this state. To my knowledge, there was only one bill introduced in this legislature directed at business's share of this program. And it was an all-encompassing bill, had a number of items within it, taxes within it.
Investment credit, principally.
Well,
jobs
I think,
credit.
Jobs credit.
Adjusted the corporate tax rate, as I recall.
Adjusted and put a minimum on the corporate tax rate. There were I think there were 5 or 6 elements to it. Business asked for, and business will react when they have a chance to go through each one of those, because there are some taxes that have a different impact on business than others. And I'm not talking just about a money impact, but a business decision impact. What we asked for and what we need is an opportunity to go over each one of those. Business is not saying we'll pay the tab for higher education. Business is saying we'll pay our share. The legislature, to be fair to it, did not provide that opportunity other than this one omnibus bill, which we did object to because it covered a number of taxes which we did not think were fair, and a number that we did, and would like to take a crack at those one at a time. But it's very important to business that education, higher education, as well as all education in this state, be improved, because frankly it's in serious trouble.
Let me ask you just finally, in about a minute that remains, about one bit of State House gossip. That is that Boise Cascade was visible on these education issues. You've been visible on the downtown Boise issue because, well, the gossip has it that John Fery's got political stars in his eyes.
Well, John Fery doesn't have any political stars in his eyes. He has a job that keeps him very busy, and he intends.
I don't say that, but believe me, in a derogatory sense.
No,
but
I understand.
lots of people are saying that,
No,
gee, you must have some political interest down the road.
No, I have a very deep and sincere interest in government, and I think as long as I am physically and mentally able to, I want to participate in government, primarily by influencing government.
Well, let me ask you the typical political reporter question. Will you rule it out in the future, elective office?
Yeah, I think I would rule it out. I really do. I don't think that's my bag. First of all, I've got my hands full in trying to run a very major and growing company that I think has a lot of opportunities. And second, I think that you can serve government, you can serve the people a number of ways other than just being an elected official.
Well, I'm sorry, we've
got
to go on that note. Thank you, sir, for being with us tonight. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
it very much. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.